All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's virtual meeting of the Northern New England chapter of SABR. I'm the chapter chair, Bruce McClure, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that voting has begun on the ratification of the bylaws for our chapter. A copy of the proposal was sent out Monday and is in your inbox if you haven't already read it. Voting will continue until Monday, March 4th at 9 a.m. with the results revealed at the Tuesday, March 5th Diamond Discourse meeting. If you have any questions or have lost the email, please get in touch with me soon and I'll send you another copy immediately. All right, now on to our featured guest. No one can argue the fact that Pete Rose is a legend, a baseball god. He was a working class white guy from Cincinnati who made it, less talented than tough and rough around the edges. He was everything that America wanted and needed him to be, the American dream personified, until he wasn't. In the 1980s, Pete Rose found himself at the center of one of the biggest scandals in baseball history. He kept secrets, ran with bookies, took on massive gambling debts, and he was magnificently publicly cast out for betting on baseball and lying about it. The revelations that followed ruined him, changed life in Cincinnati, and forever altered our game of baseball. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose in the Last Glory Days of Baseball, tells the full story of what could be called one of America's most epic tragedies, drawing on firsthand interviews with Rose himself and with his associates, as well as on investigators' reports, FBI and court records, archives, and a mountain of press coverage. Tonight's guest chronicles how Rose fell so far from being America's great white hope. It's Pete Rose as we've never seen him before. And tonight we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from the author of this highly anticipated book himself. And he's also an esteemed member of our chapter, Keith O'Brien. Normally I'd say welcome to New England, but you're already here in New Hampshire. How you doing tonight?
Wow, thank you for that introduction, Bruce. That was wonderful, amazing. I am a member of the chapter, and I'm so glad to be here. Although I do regret to inform you that I'm not in New Hampshire tonight. I'm thus the blurred out background. I'm here in Florida tonight as my kids are on winter break. So
Now,
I
before
don't
you
get
get
to
started, I
enjoy.
just want to say nobody likes a braggart, Keith.
I know I didn't want to bring it up, but I felt like I had to. I just seriously, thank you for that introduction, Bruce. You're the best, man. So it is great to be with all of you here tonight, despite the fact I'm in Florida. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this book, which is actually coming out 4 weeks from today. I'm going to share my screen here just to give you a little bit of background on this story, and I won't talk everyone's ear off here tonight. I'll just give you a little bit of background on the story, and then perhaps we can have a robust and fun baseball conversation about Pete Rose, because that's the best part about baseball, is having conversations and debates about the game. So this is the jacket, the book jacket, again, coming out 4 weeks from today. And for those of us super deep baseball enthusiasts and nerds, this is actually, and I would consider myself one, this is a photo of Pete Rose rounding second base in the 1972 World Series against the Oakland A's. That's Pete Rose at Riverfront Stadium, the long green carpet there that used to be at Riverfront. You can learn all about me on my website, which is right up there in the corner, keithob.com. And the book is available for pre-order now. So even though it doesn't come out for 4 weeks, you can pre-order it wherever you like to buy your books, and it will magically arrive on publication day. And if you would love to get a signed copy, you can do that actually through my website too. There's a link for one of our great independent booksellers in New Hampshire, Water Street Books in Exeter for anyone who's from that neck of the woods. I don't live too far from Water Street, and I go in there on a regular basis and sign books there. So if you want a signed copy, you can order it right there. If you're on social media, you can follow me in all the usual places. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever they call it these days at Keith OB. I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram as well. So that's a little bit about me and a little background on the book. Like I said tonight, I just want to talk for maybe 15 minutes or so, give you a little bit of backstory on the story, and then we can take questions and answers. And basically, in the time I have, I just want to talk to you a little about, why Pete, why now, why this book. And I want to go back to something that Bruce just said a minute ago. This notion that he was sort of a baseball god, he was an immortal, and that is true. And we've sort of forgotten that. In the last 35 years, when Pete has been banished to the hinterlands of his sport and really become a caricature of himself and a caricature of an old man shouting at the sky, we have forgotten so much about who he actually was. And the fact is, he was an American icon. And really, in my opinion, as a historian, you simply cannot tell the story of baseball in the 20th century without Pete Rose. He is there for so many critical moments for so long. Again, he's there in baseball as a minor leaguer in 1960, called up to the Reds in 1963, banished in 1989, 30 professional seasons, 30 baseball seasons, and so many important moments happen, and he's often right in the middle of it. Of course, there's the collision at home plate, All-Star Game, 1970 at Riverfront Stadium, and we all, remember this story as baseball fans, but we may have forgotten why it was such a big deal. This All-Star Game, July 1970, was up until that point the most watched All-Star Game in Major League Baseball history. 50 million people tuned in to watch. President Richard Nixon was there at the game, and indeed, President Richard Nixon stays until the end of the game. Nixon is there when Rose barrels into Fosse. We, of course, have Rose's epic fight with Bud Harrelson, recently departed Bud Harrelson, in the in the NLCS playoffs, October 1973. Of course, we have the Big Red Machine years with those epic teams in 1975 and 1976. We then have Pete Rose's impossible quest to take down Joe DiMaggio's hit record in 1978, a hit streak that ends in Atlanta against Gene Garber, who I did interview for the book. And then, of course, there is, the quest for the Ty Cobb record, 41-92, ending in September 1985. These are quintessential moments, frankly, in baseball history. And what's amazing to me is it's not even really about the hits. It's not even really about the records. It's not even about the World Series titles that makes Pete Rose beloved. People did love him because of how he played, and that was real. That hustle that we know so much about was real, and we can dial it all the way back to his humble roots on the west side of Cincinnati. One of the cool things I did for the book is really try to track down photos or things that maybe people have never seen before, or tell stories that maybe people don't know before. And this photo is one of them. This is Pete Rose's 1956 Legion ball team on the west side of Cincinnati. And I'm sure everybody here can find Pete Rose in the photo. Everybody sees him there. He's in the second row, second from the right there, and the what would ultimately become that classic buzz cut. But if you were to look at this photograph of, this was not just a city champion team, but won a national Legion Ball tournament that summer, no one would pick out the kid in the second row, second from the right, as the future baseball icon. He wasn't anywhere close to the best player on this team. In fact, the best player on this team is standing just behind Pete, the much taller boy with the blonde flat top haircut. That kid's name is Art Lube, and he was also from the west side of Cincinnati, as all these players were. And Art Lube was a tall left-hander. He was already about 6'3" in this photo. You can see he's actually taller than the grown men in the photo here. So Pete Rose, from a young age, knows that he has to play hard. He simply is not big enough. He is not strong enough. And this hustle ethic really does begin on the west side of Cincinnati as a boy. And it's drilled into him, Pete Rose, by his father. This is another photo rarely seen. This is a photograph of Pete Rose's dad's semi-pro football team on the west side of Cincinnati. This photo is from 1947. Pete Rose's dad is all the way to the right, kneeling in the front row, number 68 or 69 there. That's Big Pete. And Little Pete is right there in the photo too. He is dead center, Pete Rose, kneeling with his arms crossed in front of the man dead center. Big Pete was in and of himself a local icon in Cincinnati. He was a very talented baseball and football player. But Big Pete never made it into the pros. This was really the peak of Big Pete's career. These semi-pro football teams that played on the west side, and Big Pete drilled it into his son that he had to do better than him. He had to do more. And Pete Rose, really internalizes that and really does, want to outwork other players. And, for the book, I interviewed dozens and dozens of former teammates and opponents of Pete Rose, both as a kid and as an adult. And I many interesting insights from those interviews, but I'll just share two here. The first is, when I interviewed some of the kids who played on Pete Rose's Little League teams, they all said that their fathers rarely showed up to games. I mean, this is the 1940s, 1950s. Dads had jobs, often in factories, often on the railroad, sometimes on the barges in Cincinnati. They couldn't leave work to go see a kid's baseball game at 4:00 on a Thursday. But each of these men, now also in their 80s, could remember Pete's dad being there. And the other notable thing about my interviews with former teammates, it gets to that hustle and that work ethic as well. Multiple pitchers I spoke to, including Nolan Ryan and also Bill the Spaceman Lee, who faced Pete Rose in the World Series in 1975, and then for many years when Bill was with the Expos, said that Pete Rose was harder to get out when he had two strikes. I want to say that again because it defies reason. He was harder to get out when he had two strikes because they said Pete simply worked harder at that point and fought harder. He would bear down and choke up and do everything he could to foul off pitches. And then if he had to, poke it through the hole between first and second base. So the hustle is born truly on the west side of Cincinnati. It's inculcated into him by his father, who was really one of the original sort of crazy youth sports dads, a term we didn't have back then, but do now. And then, he makes it into the big leagues. And his first manager here is someone that you all might recognize. This is Fred Hutchinson. And in the spring of 1963, Pete Rose was, just objectively speaking, probably the third best infielder in the Reds minor league system. He was on the depth chart, would have been behind both Tommy Helms, who's a name folks will probably remember, and a lesser known guy named Bobby Klaus. Pete Rose behind both these guys on the depth chart at spring training 1963. But Fred Hutchinson, or as the players called him, Hutch, he loved Pete's hustle. And you know, part of the story of Pete Rose isn't just the hustle, but the many lucky breaks that Pete gets along the way. And one of the first lucky breaks he gets is that Fred Hutchinson, despite reason, despite objectivity, despite stats, despite the depth chart, believes in Pete Rose and gives him actually not just a roster spot in 1963, but names him the starting second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds. So Pete that spring leaps Tommy Helms, he leaps Bobby Klaus, and then ultimately leaps Don Blasingame, a longtime veteran who had played many years with the Reds and the Cardinals and a really well-liked guy. And when Pete gets up to Cincinnati, he immediately struggles because he's probably been brought up too soon, too fast. And, you know, there are rumors in the spring of 1963 that are actually written in the newspapers that Pete is going to be dropped off in San Diego on a West Coast roads trip that May because he's struggling so mightily. But they make that West Coast road trip out to San Diego and Los Angeles, and Pete doesn't get dumped off there. In fact, Hutchinson reinserts him back into the lineup. And that is really when, you know, Pete starts to find his footing as a major leaguer. But, you know, the fact that he remains with the club in the spring of 63 is notable because, you know, let's be honest, Pete very, very narrowly breaks Ty Cobb's record. So if he's not called up in 63, if he's not kept with the team in 63, it's very possible he never reaches that record. But he does because Hutch believes in him, which is one of the first lucky breaks he gets. Another lucky break that Pete gets many times along the way is that the press loves him. And they loved him for a few reasons. They loved him because he was, for starters, accessible. Pete didn't mind it if the reporters came by his locker room and sat there and talked to him. He welcomed it. He loved talking about baseball. He loved also talking about himself, and was happy to do that when other guys were not. And so, you know, he won a lot of goodwill with the press as a result. Columnists would say that if they ever needed an idea for a column, they would go to Pete Rose's locker. They often said that you could go to Pete Rose's locker and walk away with 3 different columns. He was essentially a story machine for the press, and they loved him for that. Number 2, you know, Pete welcomed them at times into his personal life. The press and many of the Cincinnati reporters would sometimes go to the racetrack with Pete Rose before games in the 1960s and 70s. And so they were really almost this close to being inner circle friends. And then thirdly, take a look at this photo for a second. I mean, there's not a woman there. There's no diversity in that room. The press just frankly liked Pete Rose because he reminded them of him. The reporters were often, you know, working class kids. Pete Rose was a working class kid. And it's not until 1979 that Major League Baseball even allows women in the locker room. And so for the first 16 years of Pete's career, the press is white, it's universally male, and really working class just like him. And so they love him, frankly, you know, because he is much like them. And often in these years, the press will protect Pete and will shield the public from what they know to be the truth, which is that Pete isn't just working hard and he isn't just in the batting cage first in the morning. he's gambling and he's sleeping around town. But because we don't know this, because we don't know these things about Pete, the fans then also love him. And he was, again, not just a fan favorite in Cincinnati, but a beloved baseball icon across the country. Again, whether we like him or not now, whether we support him or not now, these are just objective historical facts. He was one of the baseball heroes of the latter 20th century. And indeed, in the 1970s, at the end of the decade, when the Sporting News has to name a player of the decade, that player is Pete Rose. But from his earliest days, at least in the 1970s, according to my reporting, he's already gambling with bookies on the west side of Cincinnati. This photo here is taken shortly after Sparky Anderson is hired in December 1969. And Sparky, just like Hutch, will support Pete. And indeed, one of the first things Sparky does is name Pete Rose as the captain of the Cincinnati Reds. And he does this at a time when, already in Cincinnati, there's another young popular player, Johnny Bench. Many fans wanted Johnny to be captain. But Sparky names Pete the captain of the Reds in 1970, even though by that time or shortly thereafter, Pete is already gambling on sports with bookies on the west side of Cincinnati. And indeed, there's some irony after Joe Morgan is traded to the Reds in the early 1970s. Joe Morgan had a reputation in the early 1970s as being a, quote, troublemaker. And by the way, this is a term that was often used to describe young black players who spoke their minds. And Joe Morgan did that. And so when Sparky traded for him, there was discussion about maybe they shouldn't. And indeed, Sparky himself knew the reputation that Joe Morgan was, quote, a troublemaker. And so, what does Sparky do after Morgan is traded to the Reds? He assigns him the locker next to Pete Rose because he says maybe Pete will help keep Joe in line and show him how to play the game. And I do find there to be some cosmic baseball irony that at the time that Pete's already betting on sports with bookies, consorting with gamblers, incurring debts, it's Joe Morgan that they're worried about. And by the mid 1970s, when this photo was taken here, Pete's gambling is well known. This photo was taken just hours after the Reds won the NL pennant, 1976. They're back-to-back pennants. They're going to the World Series again and waiting to see who the American League will send. Ultimately, of course, it will be the Yankees. And this photo was taken just hours after the pennant, and Pete Rose is relaxing at one of his favorite places. This photo was taken at Keeneland Park, the horse track in Kentucky, where he liked to go and bet on horses, and often again did so with the press, with reporters. But by this time, at least one member of the Cincinnati Reds was concerned about Pete's relationships. At the 1975 World Series, Johnny Bench, according to my reporting, found Kurt Gowdy, the NBC announcer, on the field during batting practice. And Johnny Bench confided to Kurt Gowdy that he hoped that Gowdy might have a word with Pete. And Gowdy was confused because he didn't know Pete that well. But Johnny explained to Gowdy that Pete respected him. And Johnny said, according to my reporting, that he wanted Gowdy to talk to Pete because he was hanging out with, quote, bad guys. And again, who those guys were exactly isn't clear. But I will say this, at the 1975 World Series, there was at least one person in the locker room who was not a member of the Reds. His name was Mario Nunez. He was a maitre d' at Tampa Downs in Florida. well connected in the Florida gambling circles. And he traveled with Pete that entire World Series. So he's got relationships with bookies in Cincinnati. He's got relationships in the gambling world in Florida. And again, by 1978, according to my reporting, all of this comes to a head. That spring, sometime before Pete's hit streak begins, according to my reporting. Major League Baseball sends its director of security to Cincinnati to have a secret meeting in Dick Wagner's office, the president of the Cincinnati Reds. And the conversation that day is about gambling and about debts. Baseball is worried about Pete Rose already, but it will be 11 more years before the stories come out, the real story, and the unraveling of Pete Rose. So this is the story that I try to tell in Charlie Hustle. I really do try to tell the whole story. It is the rise and fall of a hero at a time when everything changes in sports and everything changes in baseball. I mean, one reason objectively why Pete's gambling is an issue in 1989 is that the game has changed. It is no longer an unpolished, pastime filled with lots of colorful and shady characters. It's $1 billion sport that has signed its first $1 billion television deal that winter. And in this new world, Pete's misdeeds in the shadows will not be tolerated. They will not be overlooked. This time he's going down. And so I try to tell this story in this book in an unprecedented way. I did not only do those interviews with his former teammates, but interviewed 3 different men who placed his bets on baseball: John Dowd and his entire investigative team, 2 different former commissioners of baseball, including, most importantly, Fay Vincent, Bart Giamatti's close friend. And then I did also 27 hours of interviews with Pete Rose himself before he stopped calling me back, before he shut down. And I don't know what happened. I don't know why he stopped calling me back. All I know is that he did. And the only thing I can speculate to is that, I pushed him as far as he could go. So that's the story of Charlie Hustle. And with that, I'd love to have a conversation about him, the book, baseball, writing, whatever you guys want.
So if you go down to the bottom of the screen, ladies and gentlemen, you will see a button called reactions. Click that button. You'll see another one that comes up that says raise hand. Please do so, and we'll get you in for questions and comments with Keith O'Brien. I do see a couple of guys here who are raising their hands physically. We'll get to you too. I'm going to start with Floyd Lapp. Floyd, your hand is up. Do me a favor and unmute for me. I see some hands going up there as well. Let me see if I can help out Floyd. Floyd, can you hear me?
Yes.
There you go. You're up.
Okay. So thank you very much for the book. The 2 things I learned, and there are many more, the importance of Freddie Hutchinson at the beginning, and your point about the hit streak. And secondly, I never realized that this gambling addiction, this problem, went all the way back to the beginning. I just thought it was something that happened later on when more of us found out about it. So we have this dilemma. I don't know exactly the wording in the criteria for being elected to the Hall of Fame, having to do with morals and ethics. And then we have this great performer. Is there any way of reconciling that conflict, the accomplishments and the moral ethical dilemma? And while we think of the question, think Leo DeRocha, who hung out with gamblers not only in the 40s, but throughout his career. And if you ever read the book Dem Bums, was fined $15,000 in 1947 because he assaulted somebody who was booing him. And of course, Ty Cobb. Enough from me. Is there any way of reconciling that dilemma? I ask
Yeah,
you.
great question, Floyd. And obviously it's the $100 million question, you know, and I say that, you know, Pete told me at one point that he figures, and again, this is just his math, he figures he lost $100 million, you know, being kicked out of the game. So it is, you know, really the $100 million question. And, you know, I just want to address the Ty Cobb thing real quick. You know, the Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you know, that debate was about throwing games, manufacturing an outcome at the end of a season when the outcome no longer mattered.
Right.
And I will say this, you know, it's part of the book, part of the history here. So I did go down that rabbit hole historically for a good bit, but you know, I don't belabor it in the book. I did want to understand it. And you know, I will say that there was a lot of smoke around that fire. A lot of smoke. And ultimately the pitcher who levied the original allegation and said he too was underneath the bleachers that day, refused to come to Chicago and testify at the hearings that Commissioner Landis held. Yeah. And by this point, you know, again, it's the 1920s. These guys weren't rich. This guy was back in Kansas or Nebraska, and he was farming. I mean, this was, you know, this was, you have to take a train to Chicago. But he did say that he was concerned for his safety going to Chicago in 1926 to testify about gambling at a notorious hearing. So ultimately, because he doesn't show, there's really no case to try anymore, and Landis sort of makes it go away. And it's sort of the opposite of what happens later. You know, when the allegations emerge in February 1989 that Pete has bet on baseball, Bart Giamatti, Fay Vincent, and Peter Uberoff on his way out the door, ultimately hire a man who is way overqualified for the job. And I say that with respect. John Dowd was one of the most accomplished Justice Department lawyers in the country. He had put congressmen and mobsters under indictment. This was easy pickings for a talented investigator and prosecutor like John Dowd. And so they throw everything at it. So back to your question. What do we do? How do we reckon with it? I don't really know. I'll say this. You know, on the day that Pete was banned from baseball, Bart Giamatti was asked at the press conference, what are we to do with Pete Rose? This was a nationally televised press conference. Bart Giamatti takes question and answer from the press on national live TV for almost an hour. You can scarcely imagine it happening today. It never would happen today. And at the Q&A, he's asked, what do we do with Pete Rose? Because at that time, Pete was still going to be on the ballot. On the day that Pete signs his own death sentence and agrees to his banishment, he believes he could be and most likely will be voted into the Hall of Fame at some point. But 2 years later, in 1991, they changed the rule. And only then eligible players can be eligible for the Hall of Fame. It's essentially the Pete Rose corollary. And so on the day he's banned, he's asked, what do we do? Giamatti says that he'll do nothing to change the vote. He'll do nothing to influence the vote. And that he looked forward to seeing how the writers judged life and art. And that is really the question. Are we enshrining players in our athletic halls of fame, and I mean any of them, because of the lives that they've lived? Or are we enshrining them because of the art they created, their performance on the field? I don't think it's black and white, but I will say historically, players were enshrined for the art. And it's only in the last 40 years or so that has changed. And we now seem to want our Hall of Fames to celebrate people, And that's just not really what it was set up to do.
Alex Stace, you're up.
Thanks. And following on those comments, I don't think we can separate Pete Rose's treatment with the change in society and more explicitly the rise of media, the rise of the internet. A lot of things were covered up in 1920 to 1960, the presidential behavior or what have you. So I think Rose benefited greatly by television in 1960 to 1985 and made him much more famous and popular with that hustle patina that he would have otherwise had simply living in the newspapers. And then I think that it was kind of a precursor to the internet, but the expansion of media and people understanding kind of the public image, brought him down. But he was historically fortunate, I think, to come up in a certain era, and kind of the rules changed. But the rules changed for a lot of actors, Kevin Spacey or Bill Cosby. There's a lot of things that people have been treated for and treated as pariahs in the last 25 years that didn't happen before. And I'm not saying whether that's better or worse, but it's not unique to Pete Rose, and he's not, to me, a figure of. I don't think he's been ill-treated. I think he's he's a creature of his time.
Yeah, well, let me be clear. I'm not here to make an argument for Pete Rose. My book isn't about his Hall of Fame status. It's really almost tangential in the end. What I wanted to do was look at his story through the prism of history and tell that story through granular reporting, because he is, no matter how we feel about him, one of the most complex, complicated, controversial, and fascinating athletes of the 20th century. And in part because of his scandal, he never really got the kind of biographical treatment that many of our, iconic athletes do. And so I would agree with everything you said, Alec, every single thing. He was a creature of his time. The times did change. Pete was blissfully unaware that the times had changed and thought he could still keep behaving the way he had always behaved, and he couldn't. Agree with that.
Okay, one quick follow-up. Do you think that, again, I think he was incredibly fortunate, but if he had come up in New York instead of Cincinnati, how long do you think he would have lasted, and what would have happened to him? I think he would have had a very different trajectory.
It's a great question. Interesting insight into Pete Rose. And I got this insight initially from some of his ex-mistresses and also ex-wives. For everything, and to use the word you just used a second ago, for that patina of hustle and confrontation that he liked to exhibit on the field, Pete really hates confrontation. He was not the kind of husband to have a fight in the kitchen. He would rather let the tension simmer for days. He was not the kind of player to have a fight in the locker room, say with Johnny Bench, who he did not have a particularly good relationship with. He would take little shots at Johnny in the press instead. So all that to say, I think you might be right. If he had played in a more confrontational media environment, maybe it wouldn't have gone as well. That said, there were a lot of cozy beat writers in Cincinnati in the 1960s and 70s. There were a lot of cozy beat writers in New York in the 1960s and 70s. And some of those guys also loved Pete Rose, even though he didn't play there. So who's to know, really?
Don't forget, folks, if you have a question or a comment you'd like to make with Keith tonight, put your hand up using the reactions button down at the bottom of the page. You'll see another button come up that says raise hand, and then you can get in line and have a conversation with Keith O'Brien. I'm going to go to Paul Hensler. Paul, you're up.
Thank you, Bruce. And John, congratulations on your forthcoming book. It sounds like a fabulous biography. Pete Rose Jr. comment, and also another one about the man himself. In the course of researching my own high school and American Legion baseball team, I came up with this particular nugget that's very relevant here. In a 30th anniversary commemorative published in 2018, the Enquirer of Cincinnati paid tribute to the 1988 Buddy Post 507 team. I think I pronounced that correctly. It says,
Yep.
quote, no team of the preceding 61 tournaments up to that point in time accomplished what Post 507's team did that season, led by Coach John McMitchin, assistant Tom Kilgore, and future Major League Baseball players Pete Rose Jr. and Scott Kilgenbeck. Buddy Post became the first team with the roster filled exclusively with players from a single high school, Oak Hills, to win the national championship.
I love it. Great details. And yeah, that Buddy Post team that PD played on was epic. I did interview for the book John McMicken, who you mentioned before, who had a very close relationship with the Rose family on the west side of Cincinnati throughout young PD's life. So was there for a lot of moments there. I mean, Cincinnati is, if you haven't been there, is like one of those little big towns, where everybody is separated by 1 or 2 degrees, but especially on the west side. The west side sort of is its own thing, and that Buddy Post team was a great one.
And just another quick comment. One of my colleagues at the Cooperstown Symposium on Baseball and American Culture, Todd McDormand, is a professor at Wabash. And several years ago, he was working on a multi-part, I think it was ultimately going to be a book about Pete Rose. And just the comment is he pointed out in one of those early presentations that as Pete Rose is trying to rehabilitate his image with getting away from gambling and trying to portray himself and recast himself as the good guy, Ted says, what does he do for organizing one of the first events in this rehabilitation? He holds it at a casino.
Well, right. And now it's completely changed. And I do know Todd, and we've spoken, and he does have a breadth of knowledge on Pete as well. What's interesting now is Pete seems he's not trying to rehabilitate anything anymore. If anybody's followed him in the last couple of years, he's christening casinos, placing the first bet at blackjack tables, placing the first bet at new sports books. He's appearing on gambling podcasts for a while. He had his own gambling podcast. I mean, so this is not a man who's looking to curry favor with Major League Baseball or Rob Manfred anymore. This is a man who, for better or for worse, is doing what he wants to do.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
One of my favorite stories about Pete Rose was years ago. He made some comments regarding Ichiro Suzuki's hit totals and whatnot as Ichiro was approaching and passing him for the worldwide, for lack of a better term, lead in base hits in professional baseball. And Rose denigrated him pretty well in an interview one day, and I'll never forget. The story goes that somebody related the comments to Ichiro Suzuki and asked Ichiro, well, what do you think of this? And his response was, who? C.R. McClanahan, you're up. How you doing, brother?
Good. Thank you so much for being here, Keith. And so I have a question here. In 2015, I heard that John Dowd had mentioned something in the press about Pete Rose and underage girls. And is there any portion of the Dowd report that is sealed, probably due to this fact?
So those two situations are both different. I'll take the second half first. So the Dowd report is voluminous. It's something like 6,000 pages in all in investigative reports and exhibits and depositions. And while most of it is available, it's hard to find. What was made mostly available to the press and the public initially was the summary report, which is also long enough to be a book. It's like 274 pages. The exhibits, many of the exhibits can be found and are available. They're in archives and in museums. But yes, to your question, Dowd interviewed more than 100 people. And, not every interview was relevant to his final report. And so many of those interviews or depositions are not available. And so I did ask actually for access to them from Major League Baseball. And, Major League Baseball did not satisfy that request. But the issue about the women and in particular the underage women was not part of the Dowd report. Was not part of the investigation back then. It was something that Dowd had heard of in the years after, and by the years after I mean decades after. All that to say, this Dowd made these comments. Rose sued him for defamation, and then they got embroiled in a court case. I have reviewed that court case in its entirety, and what I can tell you is this: Rose does admit to having a relationship with a high school girl in the 1970s. He disputes the age of her at the time. We may never know. There is no consensus on when that relationship began. But I did include it and the reporting around it in the book, and ultimately did actually track down the woman herself, although she chose not to speak. And I included it not because it's sensational, but because to me, it captures sort of how Pete was unraveling really as a person, and making poor choices as a person at the same moment when he was having his greatest success on the field. I mean, in this window of time between 1975 and 1978 are some of Pete's best years, most successful years, most remembered years. And yet at the same time, he is making some really terrible choices off the field with women and with his gambling.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, CR.
I'm interested to know, and maybe you can comment on this a little bit, Keith. Over the years, you hear a lot of comments about Pete's relationship with all of those guys in the Big Red Machine, the bench, Morgan, Perez, etc. It's my understanding that Johnny Bench and Pete Rose have been estranged now for an awfully long time, and I've heard some things that indicate that Bench and Morgan have led a charge to ensure that Rose can barely buy a ticket to get into the Hall of Fame. Can you comment on Pete's relationship with his past teammates on whatever teams he played on?
Yeah, so Pete remains close with many members of both the Phillies, the Expos, and the Reds, even that one Expos here. But, you're right. He and Bench have had a troubled relationship for about 50 years now. And one of the reasons why it fell apart early between Johnny and Pete, because they were friends initially and were friendly initially, let's just say. The official reason had to do about some business deals that Johnny backed away from. Specifically, Pete and Johnny had a car dealership, a Mercury dealership just north of Cincinnati in the early 1970s. And Johnny had a couple down years after his MVP season, and the Reds were on him to scale back his off-field activities. And Johnny had a lot. He was playing golf with Bob Hope. He was single. He was an eligible bachelor. He was all over the place. And so one of the things that Johnny did was he got out of his business deals with Rose, and it upset Rose. And it was, it's part of the book. He even aired some of his frustrations about it at the time. But I think And there's a lot of reporting and memoirs, including one written by Joe Morgan, to suggest that the business deal was just, the sort of tangible reason. Cincinnati, like I said before, is in the end a small town. It was even smaller then. And, Johnny was very popular, and he was younger than Pete. He was stronger than Pete. He was bigger than Pete, hit more home runs than Pete, won MVPs before Pete. And, as Joe Morgan wrote in his memoir, when he got to Cincinnati, he was told he couldn't be friends with both. He had to decide, was he going to be friends with Pete, or was he going to be friends with Johnny? So that relationship is troubled. Johnny did not speak to me for the book. I was told through back channels that Johnny Bench has done giving interviews about Pete Rose.
I've heard that. You're not the first person to say that. I've heard that Bench does not want to utter the man's name.
Well, and the other thing is, again, think about timing. 1989, that scandal, the gambling scandal, is a hot issue from February to August 1989, with Giamatti and Dowd tracking down the facts and Rose denying them, lying about it, which fuels this he said, she said kind of scandal all year. What is that year for Johnny Bench? That's the year he's being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And so the whole summer, Johnny's summer, is every interview people asking him about Pete Rose. And I think, understandably, he got tired of it right then.
You can't blame the guy. It's his time, and his time is marred by this scandal that he just can't shake. And in a way, you got to feel for him, because I think he looks at his Hall of Fame plaque and might feel a little bit uneasy with the relationships that he had with the Reds and, his involvement with Rose and whatnot. I don't know, but I can understand why he would be all done talking about Pete. I'm going to go to Molly. Molly, you're up.
First of all, Keith, thank you for joining us tonight and sharing this new book. I was more interested in how many different interviews you had to do. You were telling us about all these different people you've talked to and some who chose not to contribute to the book, but how many people do you think you either attempted to interview or were successful in interviewing for this book?
Over 100 easily. They're the obvious ones you're going to go for, right? You want to interview Johnny Bench, and you want to interview Tony Perez, and et cetera, and you go down the list. But the thing is, a lot of my story is also what's happening off the field. And so, I did try to track down as many people as I could who crossed paths with Pete Rose in any way, whether it was on his childhood teams, on his major league teams, people in his inner circle, his children, his ex-wives, his ex-mistresses. I tried to track down anybody I could, again, to try to write, what I hope to be the definitive story of again, one of our most controversial heroes. So, there were a lot of interviews. And, some of the people who spoke with me have never talked before, and so, there's some new perspective and new sort of narratives in here that haven't been part of the Pete Rose narrative until now.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest. I really appreciate it.
Dixie Tarango,
and I love the cat
up.
there.
Whoop, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Gus made an appearance here. It's nice to see that he has finally gotten over his not wanting to be on camera. He's the mascot of the chapter. Dixie, you're up.
Yes, Gus is very shy.
At times.
Keith, great stuff. All of
Thank
us who are on screen here who write things always want to know what was the process. When did you first get the idea? And how long did it take from getting the idea and figuring out you could do this to handing in the manuscript and saying, that's it?
Yeah, so I got the idea in June 2021, and the sort of final manuscript, with some changes, was probably finished about 4 months ago. So I guess, what is that? Just 2.5 years roughly. And the idea for me was just that the time for reckoning is now. I like to use a sports term. I like to joke that we're all day to day. We're all day to day. When you hear that quote in the paper, he's day to day. Well, we're all day to day. But when you're 83, that's a bit more present. And so, my goal was to try to interview folks before it was too late. And so I began by interviewing people that I knew I could get, sort of people that I knew were in Cincinnati, who were longtime friends of Pete, who would perhaps talk. And that's where I started. And, through some of those relationships that I made, I got an introduction to Pete Rose. And once I had that introduction, some more doors opened. But as I said before, I did 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete, and then it was over, and he hasn't called me back. And in that window of time when we were speaking, he was sort of opening doors for me to speak with people. And then for a while after we weren't speaking, it was a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole. I was trying to reach people perhaps before Pete could tell them not to talk to me. I don't know if that happened or not, but I do know that he was actively not talking to me. And so I didn't know what might happen. So, it was a long process, like any writing project.
Was there any part of the process that suddenly or over a length of time became much harder than you thought it was going to be? Well,
I mean, as anybody knows who's written anything here, and I know we all have, there are lots of hard spots, lots of tricky spots. One challenge I had was, when I was talking with Rose, is I didn't know when it would end, right? And so, my goal was to tell the whole story. And I do believe, as I told him and others at the outset, that if he was honest with reckoning about his past and let people inside his darkness, then people would have, again, whether they like him or not or support him or not, then people would have a greater appreciation for whatever happened. And so, in those interviews, we're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about, his childhood in Cincinnati and the high points and the big baseball moments along the way. But I also need to talk about the gambling. And so, it's always a challenge to speak with a source who, may not, take your call again the next day. But I am going to push him too. And again, I don't know what happened, but my only explanation can be that I pushed him too far, because we did not have a falling out. Nothing ended badly between us. It just ended.
So I got a couple of things in the chat going on here that I want to get in. Let's see. Paul Hensler asks, could you ask if Rose ever had any regrets about bowling over Ray Fosse?
Rose did not have any regrets about bowling over Ray Fosse.
I thought I knew that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, again, I did a ton of reporting around the Ray Fosse incident, because that is the moment when Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. Alec, if he's still here, mentioned in the Zoom earlier that Pete benefited from television. I agree with that 100%. And again, in those days in the 60s, if you didn't live in a National League town, you didn't see maybe Pete Rose at all, right? You only read about him in the box scores or in maybe Sport Magazine or something. The ready access to nationally televised games, big ones like, say, the All-Star game, changed that. And so that game really helped sort of gild the edges of this mythology of the hustle. And so, my interviews with that, I tried to interview anybody who was on the rosters that night who was still alive. I interviewed Ray Fosse's widow, Carol Fosse. And most importantly, I interviewed Sam McDowell, Sudden Sam McDowell, who many of us here will remember, who was Fosse's teammate on the Indians, who had gone to dinner the night before with Fosse, his wife, McDowell, Carolyn Rose, and Pete Rose. So I interviewed, everybody I could around that to try to rebuild that story, because it is crucial to the architecture of the Pete Rose hustle mythology.
Paul Allen asks, did Rose have any regrets or anything that he would do differently? And I'm going to assume that means in his life in general. While Ryan Schroer has a comment, he may regret singing in those Aqua Velva commercials.
Yeah, some of those commercials you can still find on YouTube.
Yeah.
Pete told me that he only has one regret, and that was betting on baseball. And, it's, to me, a little bit of a convenient answer, because I would think that, he would also regret about lying about betting on baseball. And to be clear, those lies hurt a lot of people. Obviously the lies hurt Pete Rose, but I think they hurt Bart Giamatti. I think it hurt baseball. I know it hurt people in Pete's inner circle. Prior to Pete writing that book in 2004, in which he finally admitted to betting on baseball, even his closest friends didn't know. They did not know. They believed him. And most notably, some people in 1989, one in particular, in Pete's inner circle, protected him, refused to talk to Dowd, and then ultimately paid a terrible price for that loyalty. Tommy Giosa, one of the men in Pete's inner circle who placed Pete's bets on baseball, ultimately faced a raft of federal charges, in part because he wouldn't cooperate. And so those lies did hurt a lot of people.
Thomas Duclos has a question in the chat. Was there ever any conversation or discussion around his religious beliefs or practices? He's curious as to what his early formation might have included or excluded.
Pete did not grow up in a religious household. Big Pete was not particularly religious, and did not like, Big Pete didn't, that the churches seemed interested in collecting money, and so for that reason, the Roses as kids, did not go to church. So when Pete was talking to me about that, I said, well, so do you believe in anything? Do you believe in God? And he looked at me like I had three heads and said, are you kidding me? You don't get 4,200 hits without believing in God. So at least in passing, I believe he does believe in God. And
Dick Layton's had his hand up for a while. Sorry, Keith.
Yeah,
Dick Layton has had his hand up for a while. Go ahead, Dick.
I'm curious, after all your talk about Big Pete and how he was ever present at Pete's games, about Pete Rose's attitude to his own son, who I have seen play not very well in the minor league level here in Burlington, and wondering how did his father, duplicate what his own father had done, or did he change as far as encouraging him to strive for a major league career?
Yeah. So there was a ton of pressure on Petey Rose from the moment he was born. I mean, that kid was actually, Petey Rose is on the cover of the Cincinnati Reds media guide in 1971. He's 18 months old and he's wearing a full Reds uniform. And in almost every interview that was done in the 70s when Petey was a kid, that was about Rose and his family, they always talked about Petey's future baseball career. And it seemed to be the press bringing it up. So there was so much pressure on Petey Rose. And I don't believe it was actually applied by Pete. However, for as flawed, and I want to be clear here, my reporting and my research as a historian suggests that Big Pete, was over the top. Pete himself would never say that. But for all the flaws that Big Pete had and his over the top pressuring of his son, while Pete may have not have done that, he was flawed in other ways. Pete was so invested in himself as a person, as a player, and always interested in himself, that I don't believe he showed Petey enough attention. And I mentioned before that I interviewed the coach of Petey's teams, John McMicken, who was mentioned earlier. And John McMicken said that there were so many games, and Petey is now a teenager, and his dad's in town, or the Reds aren't playing that night, and there's Petey on the fence looking for his dad, and he just didn't show up for the game. And so, he was flawed in that way.
That's really interesting. Going to wind it up with Roger Kathman. Roger, how you doing tonight?
Okay, this is the second time I heard you speak, Keith. I live in Cincinnati, and you're going to Delhi. That's where I live. I'll see you there.
Awesome.
Questions? Yeah, I've followed Pete's whole career, well, my whole baseball career. When he came up, he replaced John Blasingame as a starter, who was a very popular player. So as I understand it, the whites on the team didn't like him. And he hung around with the blacks. They kind of took him in. Terrible to talk like that. I don't care about black versus whites, but that was the way the club was. Is that your understanding? And who on the who did not like him?
Well, I think many of the established white players didn't like him. He jumped the line. He took Blasingame's job. By July, Blasingame is traded to the Senators and quickly out of baseball. Blasingame's wife was pregnant that spring, about to give birth right before opening day. It was terribly unpopular for all those reasons. And Rose, was bombastic. Even in 1963, he walked around telling people he was going to be great. And obviously that rubbed people the wrong way. So you've got, a bombastic, rookie who jumps the line, takes the job from a guy everybody likes, whose wife is 8 months pregnant. Blasingame quickly loses his job, is traded, is gone from baseball. It was all negative for Rose. And yeah, so he was not invited to hang out on the road. He wasn't in the inner circle. And And so who did he end up hanging out with? Frank Robinson and Veda Pinson. And that was real. And Robinson spoke about it. Robbie spoke about it in interviews before his death many times, that he befriended Rose because he felt bad for him. But there's two interesting things about this. Robinson and Pinson knew what it was like to feel like an outsider, because they were outsiders as young Black players. And Robinson is quickly traded from the Reds, as we all know. And I think there may have been some racial undertones to that as well. And yet, two things happen as a result of this. Multiple Black players I interviewed, who were Rose's teammates later, told me that Rose was exceedingly kind to them, and would go out of their way, his way, to help them. Rose gave a young Ken Griffey suits because Rose had a contract with a clothier, an upscale clothier in Cincinnati. Rose helped George Foster, would throw him batting practice at a time when George Foster was not even sniffing the starting lineup. And these guys remembered things like that. Foster told me specifically that white stars in the early 1970s usually weren't as nice to a young Black player as Rose was to him. And Foster would know. However, for all of this, Rose still lacked and still lacks, I think, the language or the understanding to express, complicated, cultural things like race relations. And even in the time when he was befriending George Foster or befriending Ken Griffey and helping them, he would still make jokes, where the punchline included a watermelon or a spare rib that would be, incredibly insensitive today, and most likely was incredibly insensitive then.
Yeah. Well, people around Cincinnati, I'm sure you've heard this, but Rose is a baseball savant. He's brilliant at that, but not much anything else. That's the way a lot of people think of him. Also, sorry, just a quick comments, a couple. He was told by management of the Reds, whites don't hang around with Blacks. Mm-hmm. And he told him what to do about it. Someone that slides into first base into bases like he does, you don't care too much about your looks. But yeah, sometime consider a book about the Reds. They're not considered the most prejudiced. I'm sorry, Boston is up there. But Robinson, I heard, wasn't traded because of that. There were other issues, but Robinson, Veda Pinson, and they also had Curt Flood. And I heard the rumors are they didn't want 3 Blacks in the outfield. And that's why Flood was traded.
Well, yeah, I was using some shorthand around Robinson. Part of the reason why he was traded was a long-standing disagreement that went back a couple of years. Robinson had been arrested for carrying a handgun in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
And he was frustrated for years that nobody tried to help him that night he got arrested for carrying a handgun. And ultimately Robinson was bailed out of the city lockup by Earl Lawson, who was the Cincinnati Post beat writer for the Reds. And so, Robinson was angry that nobody from ownership tried to help him that night, which I do think is notable.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I enjoyed hearing you talk. I'm sure I'll enjoy the book. Do you get into, sorry, last thing, do you get into 76 World Series where he plays so shallow against Mickey Rivers?
I do, and I actually did interview Mickey Rivers as well. Mickey was a great
Oh.
interview.
Oh, I can't wait to hear about that one. So good.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. See you in the West Side.
Yeah, what day is Western or is
I'll be there on April 3rd.
April 3rd. Good.
Yeah.
See you then.
All right, Keith, remind us how to get the book.
Absolutely. So again, thank you for having me, guys. The book is for sale wherever they sell books. So wherever you like to get your book, you can get it there. If you want to pre-order a signed copy, you can do so through my website. The bookstore is called Water Street Books in Exeter, New Hampshire, and you can buy it there. They'll ship it to you free. And I will say, anyone who does order the book, I got something special. I have Charlie Hustle bookmarks here that everybody, anybody who pre-orders the book, send me an email and I will I'll send you your free Charlie Hustle bookmark, and you can read this book and all future books with Pete Rose, as I'm sure everybody wants to do.
Love it. That's terrific. All right, next week, Tuesday, March 5th, 7 p.m., we're going to have another one of our fast-moving and freewheeling Diamond Discourse sessions. We'll be discussing some early spring training stories and get a feel for how our members think the season is going to shape up for their team. We'll also divulge the results of the bylaws ratification vote, and maybe we'll, talk a little trash about our teams. Who knows? Anyway, let's get everybody out of here. Keith, thank you very much for doing this. We appreciate you, and we will see everybody next week. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Bruce.
Hold on. Nope, too late.